All right, let's dive into one of theology's most challenging, most difficult ideas, John Calvin's doctrine of reprobation. This thing is so controversial that for hundreds of years, some of the smartest scholars out there have debated whether we should even be talking about it. So yeah, let's see what all the fuss is about.
So, what exactly is reprobation? Well, to put it simply, it's the idea that if God chose some people for salvation, that's what theologians call election, then it seems he also must have chosen not to save others. He passed them over. Now, I know, that's an idea that feels deeply uncomfortable, which is exactly why it's so critical to understand the role it plays in Calvin's system of thought.
In fact, this isn't some minor detail. The source material we're looking at calls it the hinge for the entire doctrine of God's sovereignty. The logic here is pretty stark. If you say God didn't choose not to save some, you start to undermine the idea that he truly chose to save any. Your view on this one single point kind of reveals your entire hand on how you think salvation works.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we're going to explore the really strong arguments for why we probably shouldn't even focus on this doctrine. Then, we'll hear the counterargument for why it's actually a necessary study. After that, we'll clear up a huge misunderstanding about Calvin's infamous dreadful decree, and finally, we'll see what kind of deeper questions this whole debate unlocks.
Okay, so the moment you even start to look into this topic, you'll find a bunch of scholars basically warning you to turn back. They argue that studying reprobation all by itself actually twists and dishonors what Calvin was really trying to teach. Let's dig into why they say that.
Their case really boils down to three main points. First, they say you can't separate it from its flip side, election. Second, that focusing on it totally distorts what Calvin actually cared about. And third, that historically, it's just been a weapon used by opponents to attack the faith.
Now, ironically, the first objection comes from the man himself, John Calvin. He flat out wrote, "Election itself could not stand except as set over against reprobation." To him, it was just ridiculous to think that some people are specifically chosen by God to be saved, while everyone else just what? Find salvation by accident or by their own hard work? No. For Calvin, the choice had to cover both outcomes.
And this slide really nails the point. For Calvin, predestination wasn't two different decisions God made. It was a single decree with two sides. You know, like a coin, there's a heads and a tails. To try and study one side without ever looking at the other, that's just completely missing the point. They are two halves of the exact same whole.
The second argument is really about emphasis. Critics say that Calvin's main passion, his primary focus, was always on the bright side, on salvation, on election, on grace. So they argue that obsessing over reprobation, the so-called dark side, is like focusing on the shadow instead of the sun. It just blows a minor point way out of proportion.
And finally, there's the historical argument. For centuries, people who wanted to attack this whole theological system have used reprobation as a kind of backdoor strategy. The game plan is to zoom in on the most difficult, uncomfortable part of the doctrine to make the entire idea of God's sovereign choice seem monstrous and totally unacceptable.
Okay, you got to admit, those are some really compelling reasons to be cautious. But that's only one side of the debate. So now, let's explore the powerful counterargument that studying reprobation isn't just okay, it's absolutely essential.
The rebuttal actually starts by agreeing with the critics. It says, you're right, Calvin's focus was on election, but then it flips the script. It argues that it's only when you understand the darkness of reprobation that the light of God's grace really truly shines, right? You can't fully appreciate the light if you don't understand the darkness it's pushing back against.
So why study it then? Well, the people who make this case say it does a few critical things. It reinforces that salvation is a completely 100% free gift. It's also essential if you want to really grasp the concept of God's total sovereignty. It gives a single consistent answer to that huge question of why some are saved and others aren't. And ultimately, they say it upholds that core Reformation idea of soli Deo Gloria, that all glory goes to God and God alone.
All right, now we come to what might be the most fascinating part of this whole thing. A single phrase from Calvin that has been almost universally misunderstood and used to argue that even he thought this doctrine was just awful. Here it is, decretum horrific. Calvin wrote, "The decree is dreadful indeed, I confess." And for centuries, opponents have seized on this, yelling, "See, even Calvin thought his doctrine of reprobation was horrible." But that's not what he meant, and it's not even what he was talking about.
The whole thing hangs on a translation issue. In Calvin's Latin, the word horrifabile didn't mean repulsive or nasty. It meant something that inspires dread and awe.
something so massive and profound that it makes you tremble. Think less horrible traffic and more the horrific, awe-inspiring power of a hurricane. And here's the real clincher. When you actually look at the context, you realize he wasn't even talking about God choosing specific individuals for reprobation. He was talking about God's decree concerning the fall of Adam, a single event that plunged all of humanity, the elect included, into a state of ruin. That was the awe-inspiring, dreadful decree he was referring to.
So why does any of this matter? I mean, it's a deep theological rabbit hole for sure. But it matters because getting this right or wrong doesn't just change one little doctrine. It forces us to wrestle with some of the biggest, toughest questions in all of theology.
For instance, if predestination is one decree with two outcomes, does that mean God is glorified equally by both of them? I mean, how can saving someone and passing over someone else both bring glory to God, especially in the same way?
And here's another huge puzzle. If God actively decrees reprobation, how do you keep from making him the author or the cause of sin? This is a tension theologians have been sweating over for centuries, and it sits right at the heart of this whole debate.
And this brings us to a really practical question. How can the gospel be offered freely and sincerely to all people if, from the very beginning, some were passed over? How do you reconcile a universal invitation with a very particular specific election?
So in the end, it seems like studying this difficult doctrine isn't really about some morbid fascination with the dark side of theology. It's about intellectual honesty. It's about being willing to face the hardest questions head-on so you can get to a deeper, richer understanding of what words like grace and sovereignty really, truly mean.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really provocative question that just kind of hangs in the air. If grace is, by its very definition, a completely free and unearned gift, does it, by necessity, have to be withheld from some people in order to have any meaning at all? It's a tough thought, and it's the very tension that has kept this debate raging for 500 years.